I always cringe when somebody says, what are the 3 favorite rules for interviewing someone? Or, I don't know. I get out there, you put me with an audience and people, and I talk. My preparation, my background was living among talk shows, working for Par, watching the show every night.
I'm Justin Jay. As a photographer, I've gotten to shoot rock stars, hip-hop moguls, world-class athletes, and some other truly extraordinary subjects. I'm fascinated by the backstories and life experiences that help shape these compelling people. The right photograph can reveal quite a lot about someone, but some stories can't be told with just a picture. Sometimes you need to sit down, listen, and dig a little deeper. This is The Plug. On a recent episode of a late-night talk show, the host nonchalantly presented the guests with an opportunity to plug their latest project. With apparent ease, the guest ran with the setup and responded with a seemingly impromptu series of short jokes evoking laughter from the audience. Shortly after, they played a brief clip from the guest's upcoming comedy special. To everyone's surprise, the taped clip accidentally featured the guest reciting the exact same rehearsed bit that the guest had just said moments earlier. The awkwardness was palpable, and the guest was visibly embarrassed. The incident shattered the carefully crafted illusion of spontaneity, and it showcased how modern talk shows often function as a pre-rehearsed publicity machine masquerading as casual conversation. But it wasn't always like that. Today's guest is a trailblazing TV host who played a defining role in shaping the talk format during the late 1960s. He was able to seamlessly combine his intellectual depth, razor-sharp wit, and his casual, down-to-earth charm to entice Hollywood icons, political figures, and literary geniuses to open up in ways rarely seen on television today. So how does a small-town boy with humble Nebraska roots graduate from Yale, write for Groucho Marx, and eventually become the favored talk show host of legends from Ali to Lennon, Hepburn to Hendrix? We'll find out as I sit down and ask some questions to this 3-time Emmy Award winner and one of the most revered TV figures of all time. Today, writer, comedian, and an absolute hero of mine, a true icon, Mr. Dick Cavett.
And we're live. We have a very special guest today, the incomparable Dick Cavett. And I have to say, I'm so thrilled to have you on the show. So thank you so much for sitting down. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, I'm always a big letdown, so I'm just warning you now.
Well, you've been on my short list of people that I wanted to have on the show for quite some time.
Oh, yeah?
And to prove that point, I want to just do a little quiz for you. So I want you to tell me if you have any idea what these things all have in common, okay? New York Magazine, Saturday Night Live's talent booker, PBS, Compass Realty, and Alec Baldwin.
They all have letters in the English language in them. Wow.
I'm sure I've stumped you, so I'll tell you the answer. Those are all parties that I've reached out to in the last year trying to find a contact to get in touch with you.
And who betrayed me?
It was finally the publicity department from PBS. It was I had reached out to them, and they gave me Martha's address.
Well, I've heard you always get your man.
I try. So
sometimes your woman.
This is it's a fantastic get, and I'm thrilled that you sit down. So I really appreciate it.
I'll try not to be awful.
So you recently were featured in a documentary on PBS chronicling your experiences and your conversation and your friendship with Groucho Marx.
Yeah.
And he's such a legendary figure and so prolific. But I think for some of the people who may not be that familiar with his work, beyond his penchant for wonderful one-liners and maybe as the inspiration behind the Beaglepuss glasses.
Right.
Tell me why he was such an inspirational figure to you. Why was Groucho Marx so special?
I don't know. I wish I knew. I don't have an analytical mind or an ability to describe certain things that other people do, and it bothers me. All I can say is he's obviously a world great comedian, if not the best, a great wit, and great performer. He's got everything. His voice is funny. Everything about him is good. He moves great. He has all the gifts a comedian can possibly have and a few more.
He seemed like he really resonated with you on an emotional level because he was obviously a hero of yours to begin with, and then became a mentor, and then eventually a friend. That's kind of more than somebody who's just good at comedy. Like what resonated?
Well, I would never have believed that when I first saw a Marx Brothers movie and thought, I'm going to know the guy with the mustache or whatever. I think it was Duck Soup that I first saw. My father remembers when a Marx Brothers movie, Unknown, came to Grand Island, Nebraska when he was a kid, he being a kid, not Groucho. Yeah. And he said, it's the only time perhaps that people have literally lost their seat laughing and sliding off their chairs. And I can believe it because nobody had ever seen anything like the phenomenon of the Marx Brothers.
But, it seems like comedy is often very perishable, meaning it doesn't often age well. And I think one of the reasons that Groucho's comedy and his body of work aged so well and was so timeless is because you could tell he really had a love of language, and he loved wordplay, and he loved wit, and he loved double entendre. And there was a great segment in the movie where you talked about some advice that he gave you about punching up a particular line that you had. And he wanted you to add the word certainly, as in you certainly could have fooled me.
Yes.
And, at face value, it seems like a very small change, but in context, it had the effect of it changed the entire cadence and flow and really helped sell the line.
Yeah.
And you see this meticulous use of language a lot of times, like with certain comics, whether it's George Carlin or Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah.
But there's also something to be said about the use of language and the words that you choose in the context of a conversation as well. And, you always had a very casual yet deliberate way of asking questions to a guest. And I'm wondering, is that something that you really took to heart from Groucho? Did he teach you a lot?
I wouldn't be surprised. It's just that I've never been able to explain I always cringe when somebody says, what are your 3 favorite rules for interviewing someone or talking to someone, which is not always the same thing. I don't know. I get out there, you put me with an audience and people, and I talk. It's nothing I learned. Well, I may have learned it unconsciously by the fact that my preparation, my background was living among talk shows, working for Parr, watching the show every night, whereas the other writers went home. I always stayed for the taping, watched Jack, and with Johnny, and with, I just thought of this. An example of Jack's ad-lib ability. A very fat comedian, Jack E. Leonard, was on frequently, and Jack said to me before, I'm going to trick him tonight. He only can answer when you say something, or when you answer him. He'll take your answer and make it like, I'm just not going to answer. I'm just going to nod. He did that. About the 5th time, Fat Jack, as he was affectionately known, began to sweat. And I began to feel sorry for him. And at one point, he just ran out of the great gas that he worked on. And I thought, he's got to say something. And he seemed to sort of desperately reach for anything. How many people are in the world? Some fact out of the encyclopedia. He said, Jack, my wife's an acrobat. And Jack said she'd have to be. And it was one of the great laughs of the day, of the time. And Jack was so good at that.
Who do you think is a contemporary that's on that level, that's in the public eye today?
I don't think I don't think of anybody who, to me, resembles him in any way. That's not to say we don't have people who can ad lib, but what a great thing! And Groucho, that thing you said about the word certainly, which I cringe every time somebody says, Groucho pronounced it soitny, and in print they put S-O-I-T, and they couldn't be wronger. He pronounced it soitny. S-I-G-H-T would be a closer way of rendering it. Well, yes, he could have fooled me. Yeah? And his ear told him the way it would in a quote, you left out a word, or in a piece of music, you left out two important notes. It's just you're born with that. It isn't. I don't think it's anything you can teach anybody.
There was another piece of advice that he gave you and that you talked about in the documentary that was really interesting. And you have a really unique and accomplished background. A lot of people may not know that you speak fluent German. You're a trained magician. You're Yale educated. You graduated from Yale, Ivy League.
I sound wonderful.
Ivy League educated. But you're also from a small town in Nebraska. And there was a point in the documentary where you talked about Groucho giving you some advice to really lean into that part of your bio to kind of make yourself a little bit more relatable, or maybe kind of soften your image a little bit. And I find it funny because, the buzzword of, the East Coast liberal academic elitist is thrown around so much these days. But I feel like you never really had the reputation of being an educated snob. I mean, I feel like the public really perceived you more as like a cordial, humble intellectual, if I had to, put a title to it. And I'm curious, do you think that advice that Groucho gave you really had a profound effect on the way that people saw you and your image?
I know specifically what you mean. And it's interesting because it was the first time I realized that he really took an interest in me and my career. And it suddenly hit me. And verbatim, I believe it was, saw you with Merv Griffin the other night and got that old feeling. I think you have struck a mother lode, L-O-D-E, as everybody knows, with your idea of a hayseed or a bumpkin or a kid from the Midwest or any of those, however you want to go, being thrust into the Ivy League and Broadway and New York. You should continue with this. It's a very, very good. He didn't use the word premise, but something equally interesting.
Kind of almost playing with the academic version of a fish out of water, like paradigm.
Say again?
He was almost kind of wanted you to play with the academic version of a fish out of water, and that paradigm, and kind of use that to your advantage.
That means something to me too. Yeah, I see. Down deep, I worried, I really am from Nebraska, and that's all right. And wait a minute, there's a guy named Johnny Carson, and he's doing all right. So it never really occurred to me that I was handicapped by being from the Midwest. But it's a kind of a cliched thought of, gosh, this guy came from Hicksville in the extreme case and managed to conquer it or something. But the minute I got to New York and New Haven and the Schubert Theater and Broadway plays every week coming through New Haven and Broadway in New York, and sneaking into the Jackie Gleason studio and watching him in rehearse, having gotten in by carrying a CBS envelope with the big insignia so the doorman saw it and let me in. I realized I can swim in these waters, and I love it.
I mean, that's the irony of the public wanting people that look like them in places of power or in entertainment. But the irony is that you actually want a talk show host or a politician to be well-read and to have a breadth of knowledge and to have some wit, and that's the irony.
Those all help. Yeah.
So you are in a unique position to have so much of your life documented and to be able, if you want to go back and kind of relive and watch your younger self and try and get into your head of what was going on in the moment.
That is a specific experience that only a very small number of people get to have.
And I would say it's probably even to a greater extent than, like, say, a child actor or something, because they do specific projects and then they're off screen. Yeah. But you are on screen so much. And, I'm wondering, when you look back at some of those interviews, are you ever perplexed at some of the conversational paths that you took, or are you confused at why you followed up with that particular question? I mean, in other words, if you could go back and re-interview, say, John Lennon or Marlon Brando or Muhammad Ali, would those interviews generally look the same? I mean, are your instincts hardwired, or did they develop over time?
I would love to know. You do, looking back, have the problem of, why didn't I say this at this point? On the other hand, are there only two hands here? On the other hand, watching myself, until recently, 5 nights a week on Decades. I was amazed at some of the things I said. Could pass a lie detector test if someone said, "Did you ever say this?" I would say, "I don't know. I don't think so." That, and why didn't I think to say, she'd have to be in the moment, like with my wife's an acrobat. Another thing about seeing yourself, and this is a separate phenomenon, once cursed with depression, which everyone knows is not overstating it when you have it, I still had to do shows. And I thought, I can't keep doing this until I get out of this horrible fog where nothing is pleasant and I hate everything and I just feel half dead all the time. But somehow I did some shows. I would love to be able to see which ones now were done in that. I can remember one specific one, if you can sit still for the story. It involves Laurence Olivier, but in it, one night, lolling in bed late at night, I chanced upon a rerun of a Saturday Night Live that I had hosted a couple years before, maybe. And I was fine on that. It was a success. I liked it. I thought, that's me. I'm not a dumb, doleful, inarticulate mope. And it lifted me, not totally, but so much out of the goddamn depression that it was striking. Not many people have the chance to look at themselves how they were on Saturday Night Live. It would help if they could.
I would suspect a lot of people's depression comes from the disconnect of how they think of themselves and how the world sees them. And so that must be really interesting to be able to see yourself essentially how the rest of the world sees you because you're on TV.
It does. And another thing that it's shameful to say is how watching these, I was amazed many times how good I am.
Yeah, there's no shame in that.
On this thing I'm looking at right now. I don't mean at this moment, but God, it was, I said that, I thought of that, which balances, of course, with a why didn't I think that?
I was going to say,
that.
so of the two, when you look back at yourself and you look back at those interviews, do you find that there's more instances of, wow, that was pretty goddamn funny, or, oh, why didn't I follow up with that question?
That doesn't happen that often, luckily, but it hurts when it does. On one of the Decades reruns, there was a brilliant ad lib. It just knocked me out. And it didn't play that well necessarily at the time because another guest spoke over the last word or so of it.
Stepped on your brilliance.
Spoiled it. But I can't remember now what it was. And I still have this idiot project of I'm going to go back and try to find that. It was so good. It might not have caused Oscar Wilde to envy me, but it was pretty good.
Well, at least Dorothy Parker. How's that? Yeah.
Dorothy Parker, at least, yeah. Dorothy Parker. I saw her in real life in a wheelchair. Dorothy Parker. One of the things she said, a friend of hers died. You said she'll at least have something funny to say about this as she would anything. And what she said was, they sure do die, don't they? Lord, how they die.
Wow.
And it gives me a chill even now. Dorothy Parker.
I'm curious about, the psychology and the politics of fame are something that's always really fascinated me. And it comes up a lot in this podcast. And one of the most interesting things that I've gotten to experience as a photographer who's had the opportunity to shoot some famous people is I love when someone who is legitimately successful and legitimately famous is legitimately humbled by another person that they looked up to before they were famous. And it's a really endearing interaction to get to watch.
Me and Groucho.
Yeah, and I was going to say, so obviously you had that dynamic with Groucho, but are there any other guests that you can think of where you had a really difficult time maintaining your composure while you were interviewing them?
It depends on what kind of composure I was called on to maintain. I don't remember a series of embarrassments. Specifically, there were some, but I can't remember them. I can remember, though, the first time it had never occurred to me that I would get angry at a guest. It didn't occur to me that at the time I wouldn't know what to do about it, which is what happened. What was his name? The Harvard guy. Turn on, tune in, and drive. Timothy Leary.
Timothy Leary.
Yeah. And he was on about that. And it was at a time when people were having drug problems that I knew of and so on. And the idea that a guy was saying that, telling people who might be wise enough not to turn on and become dangerous, I just looked at him and I said, I really think you're full of crap. It was a wonderful moment, but it startled me.
It came out.
Yeah, I said it and had a nice reaction. One woman wrote, "That was my favorite moment yet on television, but I laughed so hard that I dropped my iron on my foot." So I injured a woman by doing that. But we were talking earlier. I was trying to remember to whom I said, "Do you think now you could probably bring yourself to come near or answer something approximately having to do with the question I asked you?" I know it was a Watergate figure. I know his face froze. I can't be sure. I don't think it was G. Gordon Liddy. G. Gordon or J. Gordon?
G, I believe.
G. Gordon, yeah.
What about a situation where someone, rather than them, angering or frustrating you, where you were just, for lack of a better word, starstruck? You found it really difficult to have a conversation with them because you had so much respect or admiration, or you just were intimidated to spar with them?
I don't think that ever happened. No matter how big and awesome they were, I loved that about them. And it seemed to help me. And the thought of, you can't get any better than this person is, I reveled in it. I remember once being put down on the air and it hurt. It was by William F. Buckley Jr. For young folks.
Stalwart intellectual, yes.
And I said, "Oh, really? I'm not really familiar with that," whatever he had said. He said, "You don't seem to be familiar with anything." Now, that's a nasty thing to say to anybody.
Do you think
I was flustered. I said, "Oh, I'm familiar with everything," or some dumb reaction. But that's the only example of that I can find. I mean, I've had guests get angry with me, but...
Do you think it has something to do with the fact that they're in your house? How much of the power of you being in control in terms of you have control to cut to commercial, you have control of the conversation, you have the pre-production and the cards, and they're on your couch? I mean, does that give you a sense of confidence as well?
I realized that it surely did. And I've never thought about that before. So I thank you for a new thought. Yeah, there was a certain security of, this is my place. This person is illustrious, and they're fitting into it. They seem to enjoy being here with me. This isn't exactly this subject, but it's curious, related. You can have strange memory things happen. One day, when I was working for Johnny, I took my material down to his office and humorously put my pages on his desk. But just before I did, his secretary said, "Be kind of careful. He's in a funny mood, not happy." I said, "Okay." Oh, you know what I just thought of? My Playboy interview, where 1 hour and 8 minutes, let's say, into it, we looked down and the tape had not been running for at least 50 minutes.
That's my worst nightmare.
Oh, God. I remember thinking, I've only met one person who brought 2 tape recorders because that had happened to him or her, whoever it was.
I find, is the on-screen equivalent of that running out of things to say? Do you ever get afraid of that when you're on television?
I haven't. No, it seemed like I always was pleasantly surprised that I could come up with something. What was I on the way to telling you?
Johnny Carson.
Oh, Carson, yeah. I saw him just before he went on, and I would go back and stand where he stood before dropping the Marlboro that killed him on the floor and adjust his jacket and walk out to, "Here, Johnny." I said, "You feeling all right?" And he said, "Yeah, but a strange thing happened to me. I came home last night, and that day the format usually accommodated 4 guests per show. And he said, my wife said, 'How'd the show go?' And I said, 'Fine.' And she said, 'Who was on it?' And I said, oh my God. He couldn't think of any of the 4 people who he had taped with maybe an hour and 20 minutes ago, considering how long it took him to drive home. Wow. And I thought, that's crazy.
Do you think that speaks to just the monotony of doing the same thing every night? You kind of just go into autopilot?
It's the awareness that you got to do it again the next day after maybe not enough sleep, and you got to get that out of your head. You don't want to think back on it. And I thought it was kind of crazy. And then one night I came home, perhaps you can see it coming, and a house guest, and I said, how'd your show go tonight? And I said, fine. And he said, I heard it was one of your one-person shows? Or, yeah, it was. Who was it? Oh, my God. I sat right there. It took a while, really, a significant amount of time to think of, finally, you'll admit, fairly obscure name, Lucille Ball.
I think I've heard of her.
And I had just spent an hour and a half with her. Couldn't believe it. I think you have to flush it away and hope it's gone. And you're already thinking, God, I got to do another one of these tomorrow.
That's the camera's job to remember that. Your job's the next show.
Yeah. It's better not to think that way.
So I found, your show's always had such a very eclectic curation of guests. And I think that's what made them kind of special in a lot of ways. And I'm curious, getting to meet and interact with all these interesting people, what was your off-screen relationship with a lot of these guests? In other words, like, you had an opportunity to meet these compelling people. Did you often use that as a springboard to create an off-screen relationship or an off-screen friendship? I mean, were you having drinks and dinner with a lot of the guests, or were you more the type of person who would walk off set, go to the dressing room, and then just kind of retreat and become reclusive until the next show?
It's sad to say that it's mostly the latter. And people would say, God, that must be great, making friends with those people. And then I guess going to their house and going on vacation with them and having a drink. And they were busy. They did other things. I did other things. But I was lucky in the few instances where it really happened. Peter Ustinov. No one could say any talk show guest was better than Peter Ustinov for wit, for humor, for smarts. And a few others I saw later, and that they would call me or invite. I have a guilty, terrible feeling about the fact that I once got a letter from Peter O'Toole saying, after I had known him quite a while, next time you're in London, be sure to come and stay. And I got another one from somebody equally illustrious. And I thought, well, that's great. If I go there, I will, but I never answered their letter.
I mean, does that speak to...
What's wrong with me?
I mean, does that speak to just scheduling and logistics? Or, I mean, was there something about... Would you say that your on-screen personality was very different than your off-screen personality? I mean, why didn't you choose to really follow up with a lot of those friendships that you had opportunities with?
I was hoping you could tell me. I don't remember ever telling my psychoanalyst that particular problem, but it bothers me some. I could have had a lot of great times with a lot of great people, and I did, but 1/100th of many as people think you probably do. Yeah. Gee, they got along so well, they probably went out to a bar afterwards, and instead you said, no, thank you, goodbye, and maybe saw them 5 years later or never.
Yeah.
One of the things about booking a show, I got out of booking my show relatively soon and had a good staff, and they weren't going to recommend bad people, and they only good guests and so on. But I just thought I shouldn't do this because, sounds funny to say, I can always think of a reason not to have someone on. Not because it's Al Cap, whom I couldn't stand the sight of, but somebody really good. My fear was that went so great that I can only do worse the next time they're on, so we can't have them right away. So it's better, if you're anything like me, let your staff book the guests.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really appreciate about the format of a podcast is that it really allows for an in-depth, long-form conversation. You can really explore topics and have a follow-up conversation and really, get into the meat of things. And it's interesting looking back at some of the clips from your shows because, the pacing of some of those shows, it almost resembles today's podcasts more than it resembles today's talk shows.
Really?
In terms of, you have a pre-produced segment, you set up a story or you set up a joke, you plug the project, you cut to commercial,
Right.
as opposed to you would have an hour-long guest or two guests. And there was sometimes some awkward silences and then I would assume some conversational avenues that were definitely not produced or arranged ahead of time. And, I think that's what made it really captivating. But at the same time, a format like that also, it gives you a big responsibility as well, because you have to shepherd the conversation and you have to know when to interject and when to let the person talk and when to reel them back in. Is that experience something that just came with time and repetition? I mean, did you have any tools in your pocket that you used to kind of tell when the conversation had gone off the rails? I mean, what
if
barometer?
I did, I had them unconsciously because I never thought in those terms is about the only way I could put it. If I had ever thought, what do I do if I can't think of anything to say to Basil Rathbone or whoever it is? Something rescued me always. But I remember only once, and believe me, I don't know who the guest was, and that goes along with Johnny not being able to think of any of his guests. But we spoke, and I said something, and the guest just did this. And I said, your turn, and got one of the biggest laughs I ever got after an awkward, what seemed like 8 minutes, but was probably 4 seconds of total silence.
Well, what about the converse of that? Rather than you not being able to think of something to say, how did you judge when to stop the guest from talking if they just went on too long? Because, time is so precious in today's talk show format. But back then, you had a little bit more leeway to kind of have discretion to let people talk. What were some of the barometers that you would use to like cut someone off or know when they've kind of lost the plot?
Well, I remember one thing, God, I don't know what to say to this bird, whoever it is. And I said, we'll be back right after this message. And I saw my producer panic because I had said that less than a minute earlier on something else. But that, when it was appropriate and it was time to say it, worked several times.
Yeah. Well, because it seems like, the extended awkward pause in a conversation can actually be really powerful. I mean, and you rarely see it on TV these days because, it's kind of the first rule of broadcasting. You don't want dead air. Yeah. But, at the same time, the pacing of your show sometimes allowed for that. And, what comes after a long, awkward pause is sometimes really compelling. And I'm wondering, were you ever calculated in using the tension of that silence to try and elicit something unique or original or kind of take somebody off their guard? Or did you find it just as awkward as
I
everybody
like
else?
to think so. It seems inevitable that would happen. Yeah. More frequently, though, I remember thinking, okay, I know what to say next. I can see coming what I need to say. Or this guest is flagging and needs to be startled with something. Or, I don't mean, why are you wearing that silly mustache? But, something.
Yeah.
I can remember the feeling, this isn't going so great. This guest is a bit of a disappointment. And by some strange mechanism, I don't specifically, I rarely ever remember who it was, which is perhaps the mind just getting rid of uncomfortable things for you.
Because it seems you have to grapple two actions at the same time. Like, obviously, you have to listen. That's kind of the cornerstone of a good conversation. But you're also thinking about what I can say next and how this relates to what they're saying. How did you learn to train yourself to focus on the listening part rather than...
I always had a hard time listening in a way because when you're sitting there, you're not only got the guests looking at you and talking to you and you're thinking a thing to say to them, but something just happened in the audience and somebody just wrote something on a card and held it up and I didn't have time to read what it was and it must be important, but still I have to keep talking to this guest. And I remember using a couple of things I shouldn't have. Once was, again, it would be nice if I could tell you with whom it happened. I just borrowed something from Gore Vidal, which he said to perhaps Norman Mailer on my show or someone else who said something kind of long and controversial, perhaps. And Gore said, "I'm sorry, Norman, I wasn't listening." You can't say that on it. It was hilarious. And I did it once. It wasn't as much fun as I thought it would be. And I remember you could just freeze a guest that way or scare them to death. But I'm sorry, I wasn't listening. It's something, I urge you to use it once just to have the fun.
I mean, how do you suppress that little voice inside your head that kind of is saying, all right, can you stop talking so I can ask my brilliant question next, please? I mean, there's always this kind of toggle between what you're going to say next and actually listening to what they say and trying to find an avenue to follow up on.
I guess I would do what I might do now talking with you, where I would just think, wait a minute, I just thought of say, and just say, oh, wait a minute, I got to tell you this. And later someone would say, you sort of cut them off, didn't you? I said, oh, God, I guess I did. Yeah, that's a pitfall. Not such a deep pit, but a pitfall.
I was watching an interview with George Harrison recently. And, for somebody who such a hero of mine and you would think would be so compelling and so creative and so interesting, the interview bordered on belligerent. Like he really just was not giving up anything.
That is funny because I have gotten every known in the spectrum reaction to that show, including people who have watched it 3 times. People said you never did a better show. Others said that was like pulling teeth, wasn't it? Having mine pulled, or having his pulled, either one is bad. But what is the word for a wide variety of reactions to something? That's one that had that. Or people have said, you were miserable, weren't you, sitting there with Brando? And I always think, good God, no, I loved every second of it. And nothing seemed hard. I seemed to be okay. And when he said, oh, talk about movies. What was it? Kind of a dumb question on my part, but did you expect the great success that The Godfather had? He went, I want to talk about movies. Pause. And then he threw that $1 million grin, and I felt okay and said, what about the book, The Godfather? Talk about that. And that got a huge laugh. But those things don't always go that well.
Well, I mean, which guests do you find were more difficult to deal with? Somebody like a George Harrison or a Brando who really wasn't giving anything up and you had to really work to extract something from them, or the guest who just rambles on at length, but about a sentence in, you get the sense that it's a canned response that they've already told other people numerous times. I mean, did you have any techniques to try and kind of put somebody off their guard and actually extract something original?
I remember sitting there thinking, I wish I knew something more about this person to change the subject too. I understand you're mad about fishing or anything to get off their ramble that they may even have carefully rehearsed, and it's going on a long time. That's it. That's
I feel like that's almost more
Can
awkward.
I go to commercial now?
Yeah, it's
boy.
almost more awkward to watch somebody not stop talking than to have them not talk.
Yeah, you can go like this, but not recommended.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have this reputation of really putting people at ease when you have conversations with them. It's a very casual and relaxed. And, in the Groucho documentary, or maybe it was another interview, I saw you basically admit as such. And you're like, yeah, that is true. But I think it makes up for the many things that I don't have. And I'm curious, what did you mean by that? I mean, do you actually think that you have holes in your skill set, either professionally or personally, or was that you just channeling Groucho and being self-deprecating?
What would it be like? Do you remember specifically what it was? Or
I don't. I was doing some research on this.
Or make up a parallel thing.
I mean, I'm curious what you would mean by, the many things that I don't have in terms of your skill set of interviewing or in social. Yeah. And I'm curious if that was just you kind of channeling Groucho and leaning into being self-deprecating.
I kind of like your version of what it was. Yeah. I remember learning later than I should have, you're free to just abruptly change the subject. I wish I'd learned that earlier.
in life or on your talk show?
Yeah, both, I guess.
Yeah.
But on the talk show, you think, oh, God, are they going to keep going with this? And it's all right to say, oh, God, you just reminded me of the time the house caught fire and, something. Doesn't even have to be that dramatic.
And do you think that plays into what we were talking about before in terms of it being your house and you're in control, and an abrupt interjection like that doesn't play as rude as it might at a dinner party or talking to a friend?
I don't know. I'd like to know. I'm surprisingly on, what am I on? Any number of things. When people would say to me that dreadful word, either on the air or off, well, you're an intellectual. And I go, oh, God, get that knife out of my ribs. And don't say it on the air. It's a dirty word on television. Somebody actually wrote a column in my earlier days when apparently I was a little pontifical. Is that a word? Dumb it up, Dick. I can still see that headline in the New York Post. You're talking over people's heads, or it's too obvious you went to Yale or something. Oh, Jesus, I hope that isn't true.
I mean, I think that speaks to what Groucho was getting at in terms of leaning into your Nebraska small town roots. Because for some reason, I didn't get the impression that the general public perceived you that way. I mean, I think people look towards you as someone who's very learned and very well read and is witty, but you didn't kind of have that reputation of William F. Buckley or George Plimpton or like that kind of like stodgy, dry intellectual that everybody loves to hate.
Yeah. Or as the author of Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire would have said, people who talk like that put me instantly to sleep, and I resent them. Yeah. The only intellectual, I recognized you, Mr. Cavett, the only intellectual on television. Bam, I want to go. Shouldn't admit that.
It's funny.
They mean well.
That you mentioned that conversation with Timothy Leary, because I'm curious where you saw yourself in terms of the generational spectrum when you were on TV, because it's interesting now. The term generation gap almost doesn't even exist anymore, because you have 50-year-old women dressing like they're 15 and everybody wants to be young, and everything's marketed towards kids these days instead of adults, a very valuable demographic. That was not the case in 1968, 1969.
Yeah, it was a different world in a whole lot of ways.
And, age-wise, you were pretty much, in the spectrum of what would be considered the counterculture, but you were also, you didn't have long hair, and you were on TV, and you're East Coast college educated. I mean, where did you kind of see yourself between John Wayne and John Lennon in terms of, wait a minute,
I got to picture that. Yeah.
But in terms of the cultural divide?
Boy, it's something I mercifully didn't worry about, but I'm sure it was there. Am I being too hip in one way, or too pandering to certain current feelings, or trying to avoid coming off as this or that? All that miraculously is able to roll around in your head while you realize, gee, at least I'm still talking to the person. I'll worry about that later.
And how instrumental were you early on? Like, let's say when you would have John Lennon on for multiple days in a row. Was that something that was important to you? Is that something that a booker brought to you? Like, how did that happen? And why your show?
I just wanted to I wanted to know him. I knew just commercially it would be a great get, as when I got Katharine Hepburn, which almost hastened Barbara Walters' demise. Although Hepburn, I think, later did a show with her. But that one had its special uniqueness. Boy, Cavett got Katharine Hepburn. Carson must be sick. Well, I doubt that he was. He might have been somewhat envious, but I don't know. But Lennon, I just knew he'd got to be somewhat interesting. He certainly got the world in his hand at this point.
Well, that's why it was so interesting to see George Harrison on the show, because they're obviously, all four of those guys are incredibly witty, incredibly competent at putting together an interview and being personable. Yeah. And it didn't seem to shine through in that interview. It seemed like it was intentional. That's why it stuck out as so
I got to watch that Harrison one again and see if I get under the rug watching it. It's not always good to look back at what you think was great And it's certainly not always good to look back at what you think wasn't. I remember that I went to the hotel, and that's where the Lennons were staying, the St. Regis, because I remember once, the reason I remember that is that I went there to meet Peter Ustinov, and I don't know, they sent me to the wrong room or something. And I left, and later I had to say, he wondered where I was. I sent him a note saying, I find the St. Regis egregious and egregious. And he liked that, and it sort of got me off the hook. But so I go to the St. Regis, and I go up and I knock on the door. And as the stupid subtitling we get on movies, door opens. And you saw the door open already. Car begins to move, and you see the car. Door opened, and there was John Lennon in person. The other thing that caught my eye was his bed, which was right there in the living entrance to their suite. And I thought, that's kind of a strange place for the bed. But the bed didn't have any suggestion of what people would hope. It was full of envelopes and ideas and folders and briefs and stuff. But I said, what made you want to do my show? A dangerous question in some ways. And he said, well, you've got the only halfway intelligent talk show. To which I replied, why would you want to be on a halfway intelligent talk show? And there was a moment, and then he laughed, and I was relieved.
That seems right up his alley.
I couldn't resist that.
It's funny you mentioned Norman Mailer and Gore Vidal. It seemed like your show, it courted controversy sometimes, not because you were trying to be titillating or contentious, but you tended to book people who had really different worldviews. And it's funny because you see that template used so often on cable television these days, but it's certainly obvious that
let's get Mr. Pro and Mr. Con,
exactly.
Mr.
The intent
Conservative
is not
and Mr. Liberal.
It's not to enlighten. It's not to find common ground. It's just to create spectacle. And that wasn't what your show was about. It was truly like a battle of wits, not a shouting match. And, I'm curious, in this culture that we live in now where everybody's just so tied to their identity and they're so tribal and we're so like stuck in our perspectives. Mm-hmm. Can you think of a certain show that you did where somebody's mind was actually changed, or you were able to actually change someone's mind?
Ooh. Maybe I'm forcing myself to think it must have happened. I can identify with that feeling. And like a poor student, I can't come up with a good example. Yeah, that's you score one on your part. That's a good a good idea for sure. I don't remember ever really feeling I changed anybody particularly, but then why would I? How could you change somebody in that situation? I don't know.
Well, let me rephrase that.
It's that thing that has to do with Johnny not being able to guess and my not being able to think of Lucille Ball. It's there, but it was put away and followed by so many other things that I can't always pinpoint when the feeling happened, but I definitely have had that.
Well, what about the opposite? Is there a guest that your impression of them drastically changed once you had a chance to sit down and have an in-depth conversation with them? Maybe someone that you didn't respect, you didn't like, you didn't understand?
And I don't recall any dramatic example of that, but I do remember you have to learn to deal with, this isn't quite as good as I hoped it would be. They aren't quite as smart as I thought they were. And with Watergate people, I never had that disappointment. They were always as bad as I thought they were going to be, and they came through beautifully with it.
So there was never a perspective where you're like, oh, I guess I do empathize with why you would bug the DNC or why you would lie to Congress.
Well, I like to think I was cageable by what somebody did or said that surprised me. But that's a wonderful thing when it happens. I knew this person would be worth having on, but this is more than I ever thought it was going to be. That happened the first time with Peter Ustinov. Not that anybody would ever doubt he would be good. Robert Morley, Ralph Richardson, where you just thought, God, 90 minutes isn't going to be half enough. And 90 minutes was certainly not 90 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, did you find more often you wished that you did, in fact, have more time to talk to these people? Or was there a lot of shows where you just couldn't get over the monotony of like, how am I going to fill this 90 minutes? Like,
those are the extremes. The ones where, my God, this is over. I can't believe. I got so much more I want to do. And the other one, the clock over there on the wall has stopped. It must have stopped. There can't be 25 more minutes left when I don't know how I'm going to fill 5.
Yeah.
But somehow you do.
You had a show on HBO in the early 80s called Time Was, and it was a historical documentary.
I wish
series.
I had a copy of those.
I remember, even as a very young kid, I remember being really captivated by that show, and I found it so interesting. And I think that definitely contributed to my interest in politics and in history.
Really?
Yeah, I really remember that. I mean, I probably was maybe 9, 10, very young.
Yeah.
And it was a great show because it encapsulated, you did it by decade. So you do the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and it's like a good kind of primer. Is it primer or primer? Well, you're a man to be able to put that to bed.
I would say, I don't know. My God, wait a minute.
I think it's primer, but you sound like a jerk when you say it that way.
I know. A primer sounds like you're trying to be cute. You'll have to go to someone more knowledgeable than I am with your language and meaning questions.
But anyway, so it was a really interesting kind of historical documentary series, and I found it very inspiring. And I was recently at the World War II Museum in New Orleans.
Isn't that a great place?
It's fantastic.
Everybody must, listen to me, go to the World War II Museum in New Orleans.
And looking at that exhibit through the prism of where we are in America today, I found it really shocking. And you've always had a great talent at being able to parse and explain really complicated things and make it simple for an audience to understand. So I'm going to ask you, how did we get from there to where we are today? How did we get from a scenario where we had this sense of shared national sacrifice and you had teenagers who were lying about their age so that they could join the army and go and fight in World War II, to a scenario where you have civilians scaling the walls of the Capitol and claiming that Putin is our ally and the media and the FBI are the real enemy? Like, how did we get to where we are?
I don't know. It just seems to be that it has something to do with the fact that things that are good don't always stay good. I think the world is much crappier than it was in those days. There's no doubt about it. A country that has guns available to every yahoo and goof who wants one is just indescribably hateful. At least if one or two other countries had the same thing, it wouldn't be quite so bad. But
I guess we'll chalk that up to American exceptionalism.
American exceptionalism, yeah.
Do you find, are you generally...
that a prominent woman as Marjorie Taylor Greene in our country is no great compliment to us.
Do you find that you're generally optimistic about the state of our nation, or are you a little cynical?
No, I'm not. I don't know where that kind of optimism would come, but it just seems like there's more and more bad stuff than I remember. Now, I started doing a talk show at not the best possible time, in the sense that one assassination followed another, starting about my second week with probably Bobby Kennedy
in 68.
And George Lincoln Rockwell, just to give equal time to the bad side, and one after another assassination. And I was always having to cancel all the guests, the show I was going to do with a top comedian at 90 Minutes and getting thoughtful people to talk about the ghastly thing that had just happened.
Are some of those shows, did you find them really cathartic and useful in terms of like trying to explain the unexplainable?
Well, I found that people liked it and said, thank you for doing that. I was so miserable and I wanted somebody to talk about this. And there were soap operas on. And then you came along with that show in which Lauren Bacall said this great thing about this. And you had Senator so-and-so who was so wonderfully articulate and said so many things that comforted me. That makes you feel good. And I don't know why anybody wouldn't do that. Some people don't or didn't. And I can see why. It's risky. But, yeah.
Did you intentionally try and mask your politics when you're on air? I mean, you see, like Johnny Carson, for instance, like you can kind of interpret what his beliefs were, but he never really wore it on his sleeve, kind of by
I remember
by
the
design.
other day somebody writing something bad about me and saying, But Johnny Carson, at least, you never knew if he was a Republican or a Democrat. And Cavett, there was one remarkable exception. One night, just before going to commercial, Johnny said that a fact that this bigoted Southern governor, whoever it wasn't Lester Maddox.
George Wallace. Yeah.
Could be a candidate in anybody's mind for being voted for as president is just shocking and shameful and disgusting. We'll be right back after this message.
Wow.
And I thought it must have gotten to him where people kept saying, tell us more about your feelings. I don't know what.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting now in the context of, today's on-screen personalities. It's almost by design. You watch the one that kind of speaks to your political views. You know? And it's very obvious who's on whose side,
Johnny had a funny trait. He was smarter than he thought. That's kind of a condescending thing to say about something, but he was. He made a point of reading current, thoughtful magazines, and New Republic and stuff like that. But he didn't ever really feel too comfortable. And I don't remember if it was Johnny or somebody else who said, hasn't anybody ever told you this? Don't ever let them know what your politics are or make any jokes about one side, because then you'll lose half your audience. Bob Hope said that guided him. Hope, great Bob Hope, lived into a time when people got sick of his super patriotic Americanism.
Well, I mean, that's the interesting thing about patriotism, is that it tends to mean something to different people at different times.
Yeah. Don't patriotism me. Boy.
I'm curious if you have a sense of fraternity with the talk show hosts that were either slightly before or after you. I mean, did you view you and Carson and Parr and Merv Griffin and Mike Douglas and Tom Snyder? Are you part of a small fraternity?
It seems like it. Yeah. I remember thinking they're doing what I do, and they're good at things I'm not, and I hope I can learn to do that. And then I would be shocked at times. I liked Mike Douglas, but when I was on his show once, he said something, and then I said something, and he didn't answer. And somebody notable was at that point his assistant director or something, held up a card saying, "And then what?" so he could see it.
Yeah. Did you have a relationship with...
He's a good guy, though.
With Phil Donahue? Did you know him well?
I was on with Donahue. I liked him. Oh, but a hair moment. I must not have thoroughly liked him, because on that show, before I went on, somebody said, Donahue's just eaten up by the fact that he's never been on The Tonight Show, and that's the only thing he wants. And I said something slightly ambiguous about Johnny, and it was no way insulting. It was just, he's more this than that or something. And he pounced upon that to say, I don't know why everybody's criticizing him. He's wonderful, and it is nobody's business what he thinks. He's just a genuine treasure. And I said, he's still not going to have you on the show. I don't know why I couldn't resist that.
And was it a very competitive atmosphere between all of you, like it is now? I mean, maybe not so much anymore, but if you look back and 10 years ago, the whole
I didn't think so.
Nighttime talk show host war.
I would call Johnny and ask him, what do you do when this or that happens? And we were always friends, and people would write, Cavett's straining every muscle to knock the king off his throne. Oh, bullshit. It never occurred to me that I would. I hoped I would last a while, but we were never enemies. I liked him, and he had certain insecurities. It goes back to I already said it. He was smarter than he apparently felt himself, trusting himself to be. And he had problem. His mother, for example. Do you know anything about that?
No.
He told this on the show once, somewhat surprisingly. At some point, maybe early, middle of his career, he got some very prestigious award, and he was very pleased with that. And he told his mother. She said, well, I guess they know what they're doing.
Wow. Your relationship with some of the talk show contemporaries, like who was in your class, so to speak, in terms of when you first came up? I know Merv Griffin was a little bit older than you at that time, but it's funny how
I worked for him.
Exactly, but
and was on his show.
It's funny when you're 15 and somebody is 19 or 20. That's a huge difference. When you're 71 and someone's 75, it's almost negligible. So, I mean, at what point did you become contemporaries with all these people that you worked with?
Gosh, that would be interesting to know. I don't know. I didn't think of them as competition in any way. And first of all, I never dreamed I would be on the air as one of them at some point, which then I was. Merv, I was used as a stick to beat Merv with an uncomfortable number of times, and other people, even Carson. Dick will have John Kenneth Galbraith on, or Senator so-and-so, or Professor so-and-so, while they have Charo. That's the difference between them. And I thought, you don't need to do this. I mean...
and is that a metric of your show was a forum that, I don't want to say smarter, but let's say more intellectual people were willing to come on, or was it a product of the bookers?
They were, yeah. And I liked that, but I certainly never, ever was fool enough to try to appear intellectual, so. I feel sorry for people who took me as an intellectual, as sometimes they pronounced it when they recognized me on the street. I just think it's too bad they've probably never seen one if they think I'm one. There are real people with the discipline and the dimensions and the thought and the wisdom to be intellectual.
And they're generally writing books or teaching, not on television.
Yeah, true.
One of my favorite clips that I saw recently, I was doing some research, and you had on Sly Stone in 1971. Apple Plus has a fantastic series on right now called 1971. It's like maybe a 6 or 8 part documentary.
On the year, that single year.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely deals with culture and politics, but the thread for all the documentaries or albums that came out in 1971. And it's an interesting year because you always hear about 1968 and the Summer of Love. You hear about 77 and punk rock, and you don't really never hear about 1971. But you had like Exile on Main Street, Joni Mitchell's Blue, Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, Sly and the Family Stone's There's a Riot Going On. I mean, there's just an amazing group of albums that came out in that year. But they had on Sly Stone from 1971, and this really speaks to the difference in the pacing of talk shows today, because they had a performance segment, which was actually jaw-dropping. Like, it was an amazing performance. And then without cutting to commercial or anything, you physically walked him over to the couch set. And at that point, it was unmistakable that he was out of his mind on cocaine. Yeah. But you didn't cut to commercial. And it was really interesting. You would never see that today.
I'd like to see that. I'm glad you reminded me of that. I remember having Sly Stone on again, and it was a sort of a sense of making up a bit for his previous appearance. But yeah.
You handled it well. I think you actually waved to him at some point as if to infer that he was not, as you waved to him as if to infer that he actually was not even present in the room. Yeah.
God, leave it to me.
What keeps you inspired these days? What are you working on?
Getting over some of the last vestiges of a stroke that I had few years back, but not the kind that ruins you totally. In the hospital, in the first part of it, there was a poor man who was learning the alphabet again, and that sort of thing can happen. In my case, I didn't get those bad things. My right side didn't work as well as my left side, and there's some vestiges of that still. I still be wise to walk with either a walker or a cane, though my balance is getting better, you'll be glad to hear. But that sort of thing can last, but it can be not as awful as people think. And I think my brilliant wife, Martha Rogers, for those who know her books on business practices and so on, said, because of the good you did talking about depression on television, in print, New York Magazine, It never occurred to me not to. Some people say, don't do this. It's going to kill your career and everything. But even if it had, I would enjoy the fact that I still do of people who come up and say, you saved my father's life. When he saw that you had this, he was not at least ashamed to have it now or that he's had it. And I got a lot of those, and that's great. My daughter turned herself in, someone would say, because she saw you talk about having admitted you had depression and getting treated and so forth.
Are you happy to see that there's a lot less of a stigma around that these days? I mean, there's a handful of prominent figures that have come out and spoken about it publicly.
I think it would be hard not to, because there is that reward of running into the people you helped, and it's rampant. It's not vanishing. It's not under control. The wretched times that we live in now have just quadrupled, if not more. Hordes of young people have it.
Have you found that it's related to any particular circumstance, or is it just it's just an abstract feeling? In other words,
I'd like to know
when your life is going well.
Well, people experts in the field wonder, why are we getting so much? It's hard to get an appointment with a helper, a psychiatrist, a counselor, because there's so bloody much of it. And one of the bad things about depression is suicide. It sounds like cute to say, but Jesus, that's one of the great dangers. And again, if you have a child or a friend who has it, bear in mind that could easily happen, and get them help. Do what you can. Turn them in. Tell them to turn themselves in if they don't want anybody to know about it. God, the number of people that is claimed is enormous.
Did you lose a lot of friends to drugs during the 60s?
Yeah, not a lot, but several. Enough. Sad cases, yes. It angered me. I just thought, aren't they so goddamn dumb as to... I remember saying to dear Janis Joplin, we were in Sardi's restaurant, having a nice chat. And something led me to say, if you're on heroin, I'm very sorry. Would I know? And she said, well, who would care? And I didn't have a ready answer for that, except I would. Yeah, but poor Janis.
It's just so interesting because it speaks to this desire for kids or just people in general to be famous. I think there's this subtext that once you are, that your problems will go away. And then those feelings of feeling unwanted, or those feelings of having a sense that nobody cares about you, will disappear because the whole world cares about you. And it just seems so ironic to me that somebody could be so famous and so lonely at the same time. It seems such a paradox.
Yes. For one thing, you make the mistake of thinking, well, you'd think fame would be enough, that they're living a happy life, jolly all the time, recognized wherever they go, having people want things from them and being able to give them. But no, God, the sick percentage among the fame, the depression among the famous, the suicides are evidence that it isn't a cure-all for everything, if anything.
We always like to end the podcast by asking the guests to plug something that they're not directly involved with, but they feel maybe isn't getting enough attention in the cultural landscape. Whether it's a book or a movie or an artist or a social cause. Is there something that you've really been into lately that you want to bring a little more attention to?
I'll tell you something interesting. This may not be what you were after, but I posted somewhere months ago this information for people who are or know someone who is lost in sorrow, in depression, in having lost someone, in what's the word I'm...
Grieving?
Grieving, yes, thank you. I should have met you earlier. Who was just lost in grieving, in mourning for a relative, a wife, a child, a husband, one of those people. And I asked the brilliant guy who was my only analyst years ago, Carly Simon, got me to Dr. Willard Galen. And I wondered him, I said to him, are there any good books on the subject of grief? And he said, well, there is one. It's called A Grief Observed, Did everybody get that? A Grief Observed, and it's by C.S. Lewis. But someone would say, but it's not, someone might say, tainted with too much religion, a thing he was, a field of his. It's really, really good in that way. I remember giving it to Vanessa Redgrave when her sister died, and she buried me in flowers thereafter and was very grateful, and some other people. A Grief Observed may save the life, the current life, at least brighten it, of somebody you know or are.
So it's a Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis,
of Alice in Wonderland fame.
Lewis, like in Jerry Lewis. I worked for him. I wrote for Jerry Lewis for a season.
What was he like?
And I liked him.
It's interesting from someone from my generation, looking back at the character of Jerry Lewis, and you kind of write him off. You may like him, you may not, but you write him off as just the goofy kind of nutty professor character.
Yeah.
But if you read, there's a book called Dino about Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis is obviously a large part of it. And you realize those two were the biggest stars of the 20th century at that point in time. I mean, just you can't overstate how famous and successful and rich and in demand they were.
When they played the Copacabana Club in New York, you couldn't get in. People fell to the floor, literally laughing, slid right off their chairs. Jerry had a dangerous thing he did where he would suddenly be standing and make himself horizontal and crash to the floor. He injured himself a number of times doing that. But he was a great talent, pissed away much of it later on somehow. But he was a real comic talent of Jim. Smiling certainly saved a few guys an awkward exit.
That's amazing.
That's interesting. I hope the world is glad to know that.
Yeah. Well, Dick, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to sit down. This has been a long time coming. I really have put a lot of energy trying to get in touch with you. And
I hope you haven't recorded any of this.
I'm so glad that we finally were able to make this happen.
Well, I've had a wonderful time.
I really
They should all be like you. No, you should instruct people how to do this.
Oh, that's really sweet. Yeah. Well, I very much appreciate that.
Yeah, it's the truth.
I wish you all the best of luck.
And I don't say that to everybody.
All right, I'm going to check the videotape and make sure that's not true.
Find out.
Thanks for listening, and a huge thanks to today's guest for dropping in. If you enjoyed this episode, do us a favor and take a minute to rate, review, follow, or subscribe. This episode of The Plug was executive produced by Peter Buckingham, with original theme music by Andrew Van Weingarten and Dan Drohan. Logo design and branding by Italic at www.italic-studio.com. Sound design by Brad Worrell at Soundwag, and you can check out my photography at justinj.com. Thanks again, and be sure to tune in for future conversations.